In this example, I want to go ahead and take a look at the three different ways we could use styles with our HTML. So to start with, I want to start with an existing project. So I have a project called CSS, and it's structured the same way we'd structure all of our projects. So we have an images folder, a style sheets folder, and a web pages folder. And I want to start off by creating an HTML page that's going to reside in web pages. So in order to do that, I'm going to change from plain text to HTML. So I changed the template that Adam's using, and I'm going to go ahead and start with a empty HTML page, and I'm going to resize the window here. And I want to look at different methods of styling HTML. So styling HTML. Okay, and I want to start with a simple example of the three different ways we could style an element. So style rules can be applied in really three different spots, and I want to show you those three different spots. So the first way we could style an HTML element is what's known as an inline style. So if I go ahead and I have h1 tag, so I'm going to have an h1 tag, and we'll just put some arbitrary text here, so Madison College. And using inline styles, the idea would be that directly in my HTML document, I would have some style rule. And the way I would do that is with an attribute within our h1 tag. So I'm going to go ahead and add a style rule. And that style rule is going to be made up of key value pairs. So for instance, I might change the color. Okay, so I'm going to change the color to red. And I'm saving this file in my web pages directory as index.html. Okay, so now that it's here, I can go ahead and start up my live server. And I can navigate out to that page, and you can notice that the text is red. Okay, so life's good there. What we're doing is what's known as an inline style. I have a style rule applied as an attribute of an element. So I can define, the color being red. I can change the text decoration to underline. Okay, and that should take care of the underlining. So I can add style rules as attributes of an HTML element. This is what's known as an inline style rule. Okay. Additionally, another way to style elements, so this is one way, another way to style elements is to have an internal style rule. So I'm going to go ahead and have another h1 tag. And this style rule I want to apply to this particular h1 tag. So I'm going to have an inline style rule. I'm going to go ahead and have, sorry, not inline. I'm going to have this as internal. Okay, so Madison College. And I'm going to call this internal styling. And this is going to be Madison College inline styling. Okay, the idea there. And with this internal styling, the way this is going to get handled is I could have a style rule defined within a style section up in my head. So I can go ahead and say I want to have beginning and ending style tags, and I really don't need this media equal to screen. We'll talk about media selectors and media queries as we go on with the course, but I'm going to have the style section, and then I can apply style rules. So what's going to happen is let's say I want to style this h1 tag. I'm going to go ahead and have a class called internal. Okay, so I'm defining a CSS class, and because I have that CSS class, now I can select this particular h1 tag as opposed to this other h1 tag that doesn't have that class attribute. So the way I would use styling rules, I'm going to use a CSS selector here, and we'll talk about kind of the syntax of CSS today as well. But for this example, I want to select that element or all elements that have that class of internal. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a class selector. I'm going to say that I want all of the elements that have that internal class to have this styling rule. Okay, so the styling rule that I want is I want the color to be blue and the text decoration to be underlined. Okay, so now I'm saying all of the elements that have that class internal should be blue and underlined. Still an H1 tag, but now you'll notice that that internal style rule is kicking in. Okay. And so just to keep the flow going, hopefully there's some questions that are coming up, but to keep the flow going, the third type of styling that we could have is an external style, which would be applied through an external style sheet. Okay, so I want to go ahead and continue this example. I'm going to have a third H1 tag. It's going to be Madison College, and then in parentheses, external styling. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and give this an ID selector, or an ID attribute, external. And what I want to do with this is I want to have a rule for this H1 tag, a style rule, that's defined in an external style sheet. So in my HTML, I have to link to an external style sheet. So I'm going to link to an external style sheet. That external style sheet is going to be up a directory in the style sheets folder, and then we'll have master.css there. Okay, so I'm going to link to an external style sheet. This is the correct relative path. In style sheets, I'm going to go ahead and add a new file called master.css. And right here, I want to use a selector that's going to match only this H1 tag that's on line 19. So the way I'm going to match this H1 tag is I'm going to say all of the elements that have an ID of external should have these styling rules. So I'm going to go ahead and take that ID called external, and I'm going to apply these style rules. So the color is going to be green, and the text decoration will be underlined again. Okay, and now you'll notice that I have all three of those different H1 tags styled. So they all have a style attribute applied to them, the color, and they're all underlined. What is not necessarily intuitive from the web page is how they're styled. So the first, Red Madison College, has a style attribute that defines the fact that the color should be red and the text should be underlined. So it has that inline attribute, and that's what's known as an inline style. The second one, the blue with the underlining, is accomplished using internal style. So I have style rules applied to this particular HTML page, and that's done with a style grouping by creating styling rules, the same way I'd apply style rules in an external style sheet, but this is what's known as an internal style sheet. It applies to this particular page. Okay, so this style rule applies to this particular page. And then finally, we have the green Madison College with the underlining, and that style rule is applied with an external style sheet. Okay, and where we see that is we're linking to our external style sheet, and in the external style sheet, we used a selector that would match the elements that have the particular ID external, and we take those elements and we make them green and underline them. And that's defined in this master.css. Okay, so that's how we're changing the color and underlining that particular element. Really, what I want you to take away from this, though, is that there's three different ways that we can style these H1 elements. So we're essentially accomplishing the same thing, but we're doing it in 3 different ways. So we have inline styling, we have internal styling, we have external styling. You should know the difference between those 3 different types of styles, how that styling was accomplished. Okay, where this gets interesting is when we start to think about styling and how it's accomplished. There is some impact in terms of where these styling rules are applied. And I kind of avoided the issue, and by that I mean we have 3 H1 tags. The first one it's pretty clear, since we're using an inline style, that this H1 tag should be red and it should be underlined. So if I'm looking at this H1 tag and I'm just looking at line 15, you can see in the HTML that H1 tag should be red and it should be underlined. But what's not so clear is what happens if in my internal styling, instead of using a selector to say select all of the elements that have the class internal, what if instead I said I want all of my H1 tags to be blue and underlined? Okay, or if in my external rule I said I want all of the H1 tags to be green and underlined. Okay, so I can have conflicts with my styling rules. Okay, and I avoided those conflicts because I set up a class so I could select only the elements that have that class that would only apply to line 17, and then I set up a styling rule that said, I only want the elements that have an ID of external. So at this point I've avoided all of the conflicts. However, conflicts can come up and they do have a systematic way of getting resolved. So let's take a look at that next. So we know there's 3 different ways to style things, and we really have to decode the way those styling conflicts are going to get resolved. So the way I want to do that is in my internal rule. So instead of having this class selector to select the styling rule, I put a comment there, and instead what I want to do is I want to say all H1 tags should be blue and their text decoration should be underlined. Okay, and now you can see how I've created a conflict there. The idea is that this first H1 tag, I say that it should be red and it should be underlined. The second H1 tag doesn't have any styling rules. It has a class, but no inline styling rules. So then what's going to happen is we're going to look at the inline or the internal styles, and it should be blue. The last one, we have the fact that it's an H1 tag, so it should be blue and it should be underlined. But then we have another conflict because we have an ID being external and we're linked to an external style sheet, and that external style sheet tells us that that third H1 tag should be green. Okay, so what I want to do now is we kind of know the setup. We know that there's some conflicts. What I want to do is I want to look at the page and figure out how those conflicts got resolved. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then I'm going to skip over to my browser window, and I'm going to refresh the page, and you'll notice that things are not necessarily different. Okay, so if I'm looking at this, everything's saved. The first H1 tag is red. That's still the case. Okay, so that's getting applied from the inline styling. So the inline style says it should be red, but wait a second, we had a conflict. So we have this H1 tag. We say it should be red because of the inline style, but then we also have this style rule that says that things should be blue. Okay, so this H1 tag should be blue, and what ends up happening is the inline style will win out over the internal style. Okay. Second H1 tag, we have this internal style. Okay, so the internal style, we don't have any CSS rules or any style rules about this class, so we can kind of ignore the class. It's commented out for the time being. But it is an H1 tag, and all of our H1 tags should be blue. Okay, so I think that's fairly straightforward. Our internal rule is going to take effect. That H1 tag is going to be blue, and you can see that it is blue. And then lastly, we have this external style sheet. With our external style sheet, what ends up happening is we do have a conflict, and by that I mean all H1 tags should be blue. So if I'm looking at line 25, this H1 tag should be blue. But then I also have this ID, and in my external style sheet, I mentioned that anything with an ID of external should be a color of green and underlined. And you can see that in fact it is still green and underlined, so that external style rule is taking precedence here. Okay, so what I want to look at though is what happens if we move this external style sheet reference above our inline style. Okay, so I just moved the location where this external style sheet is linked to, so I moved it to the top or above the style rule, and I'm going to go ahead and save it. And now I'm going to go back and take a look. Still same thing going on here. Okay, so life's good there. What if I have a conflict even within the same level? So whether it's an internal or an external or inline style, what if I say that this external element, so something with an element or an ID of external, has a color of black, and the text decoration of none. Okay, you'll notice that that style rule is taking effect here. And the way this is going to work is there's a hierarchy of style sheets. So what I want to do is I want to take you out to the browser window and walk you through how precedence works with regards to internal and external style sheets. So there's a Stack Overflow link here, and there's a lot of debate about this, and you can kind of go back and forth what takes precedence and stuff like that. And you'll notice that the correct answer that they give is that there's the browser default, and then any external style rules that you might have, any internal style rules that you might have, any inline style rules that you might have. So the idea is that you'd end up with a combined style rule. So you start with the defaults, then you would apply any external style sheet rules, then any internal style sheet rules, and then any inline style rules. And that's kind of the way I learned about CSS. Although you'll notice that with our example, that's not exactly how things worked. So if we go back over to our window, we have our external style rule that's going to say how our external element would get styled, and then we have an internal style rule that should take precedence. It should overwrite that by making it black, and that does happen. Although if we didn't do that, it wasn't happening. And the idea is that there is no precedence for internal versus external style rules, but there is precedence within that same subset. So if I'm looking at this internal style rule, I have a conflict between my H1 tags. So I say all H1 tags should be blue and underlined, but then I come back after the fact and I say, well, yeah, that's the case. All H1 tags should be blue and underlined, but then in the very next line I say, well, anything that has this class of external should be black and should not be underlined. It shouldn't be a decoration. So that's going to actually affect line 30. Okay, and the way this works is the last style rule within the same styling technique, whether it's internal or external, is going to take precedence. So in our case, this style rule will take precedence if there is a conflict to get resolved. So I'm looking at line 30, there's a conflict to get resolved because with our internal style rule, we're saying all H1 tags should be blue and underlined, but then immediately after the fact, this H1 tag has a conflict, but because it also has an ID of external, and then we decide to change the rules, we change the color to black and no underlining. So now we have a conflict, and you'll see how that gets resolved when we actually look at that element. That same thing would apply if this was happening in an external style sheet. So if I had that same conflict in an external style sheet, the last style rule to get applied, and we're just talking about hierarchically, that last style rule to get applied would take precedence. Okay? So if I came back and said all H1 tags should be, and I don't know that we have any that are green right now because we have other styling rules that are going to take precedence, but if I had a color set to yellow and the text decoration to none, this rule would take precedence for any H1 tags over this rule where I'm defining it based on the ID. Okay, and it's more complicated than this, so I'm simplifying things, but what I really want you to know and what I want you to take away from this screencast is that there's 3 different ways we can apply style rules. We can have inline style rules. So we have a style attribute, key value pairs, inline style rules. We can have internal style rules. So we have a style section up in the head of our HTML document, and we can apply style rules there. Or we can have external style rules, and that's the idea that we have an external style sheet. In that external style sheet, we define style rules that would be applied to certain elements. Okay, so those 3 different types of, or 3 different ways to style an element. And then there are conflicts, or there's going to be conflicts, whether I'm selecting an element by a tag name or by an ID or by a class. There's going to be conflicts and conflicting style rules for elements, and how we resolve those conflicts is basically the last defined style rule is the one that's going to win, as long as they're at the same level, whether they're internal or external. As long as they're at the same level, the last one's going to win. And then finally, the kind of granddaddy of them all is that if I have an internal style, that's always going to take precedence. It's the closest to that element, and it's going to take precedence over any other style rule that we've encountered up until that point, whether it's internal or external. If there's conflicts or not, this inline style is going to take precedence over everything else. And that's how we're going to resolve those conflicts, and we'll get better at that as we go throughout the semester.